Today for our daily cancellation, I must once again cancel Kamala Harris. Now, at this point, the bar for Kamala cancellations is pretty high. If I canceled her every time she said something embarrassing or stupid, we'd never be able to talk about anyone else during this segment. So she has to really bring the good stuff in order to earn it. And she really did earn it this time. Listen.
Is agreeing to voter ID one of those compromises that you'd support?
I don't think that we should underestimate what that could mean. Because in some people's mind, that means, well, you're going to have to Xerox or photocopy your ID to send it in to prove you are who you are. Well, there are a whole lot of people, especially people who live in rural communities, who don't. There's no Kinko's, there's no Office Max near them. People have to understand that when we're talking about voter ID laws, be clear about who you have in mind and what would be required of them to prove who they are. Of course, people have to prove who they are, but not in a way that makes it almost impossible for them to prove who they are.
Almost impossible. So there she was on BET giving her thoughts on voter ID. Credit where it's due. She is correct that for people in rural communities, there's no Kinko's nearby to photocopy an ID. That's because Kinko's doesn't exist and has not existed for like 15 years or something. Rural Americans are as near to Kinko's as they are to, a Heckinger's or an Ames department store, and because they don't exist. And come to think of it, she's correct about the rest of what she said also. I just moved from a rural community where I lived, and the only photocopier we had was an old Amish man named Gabriel who would produce a sketch using coal and parchment paper in exchange for a bale of hay and 3 ears of corn. But old Gabe didn't work as fast as he did in his younger years, so it would take a good 6 months for you to get the document sometimes. I didn't even know that these newfangled photocopiers existed until I moved to the city. In fact, I walked into a Staples. I got here to Nashville, and it was my first time being, around buildings and cars and everything. And I walked into a Staples, and I saw people reproducing images with these large, noisy machines. And the first thing I thought was that it was some kind of sorcery, especially because it stopped working the minute I dumped a gallon of holy water on it. These dang city folk are in league with the devil, I tell you. Actually, I do unironically believe that many people in the city are in league with the devil, but that has nothing to do with their photocopier technology, which, contrary to Kamala Harris's claim, we did have access to out in the country. In fact, we had computers and phones, not to mention electricity and running water. We even had them there fancy things that kept our food all cold and icy-like. Refrigerator, I think it was called. As a matter of fact, even though I was a simple country boy, I knew, and this is what I did, because I was a little bit far away from the nearest place to photocopy. And so I knew that I could make photocopies on my phone. Anyone can download an app for free that will scan any physical document. There's a nice little tip for you if you didn't know that. Really, really convenient. I also knew that I could buy a copier and printer if I wanted to. I could go on, the internets and go to Amazon. You could order one, they'll send it to your house. Or if need be, I could get in my horse-drawn carriage and make the journey to FedEx or Staples or the post office or any of a dozen other places that can handle the complicated task of photocopying an ID. Whatever method of photocopy you prefer, the good thing is that wherever you live, if you want to participate in a presidential election, you have 4 whole years to figure it out. Is there anyone in America who can look back at the last 4 years of their lives and say that during that entire time frame, they were simply unable to make it to a Staples? Even Gabriel the Amish guy could get it done in 4 years. Even if the nearest Staples was 400 miles away and I was living out in the wilderness and I had to walk the whole distance, and yet somehow I had an ID in the first place, I could still do it in 4 years. With time left over, time to spare. There is quite literally no conceivable reason why any single human being in the modern United States should be prevented from voting by voter ID laws. And that's probably why people like Kamala Harris never provided any actual examples of any specific real-life people who wanted to vote and yet were unable to vote because during the course of the preceding 4 years, they were unable to get an ID and or make a photocopy of one. I contend that such a person does not exist. And note that if such a person did exist, it still would not prove that voter ID laws are bad or unreasonable or cumbersome. That the law is cumbersome to a small minority of extremely incompetent people is not an argument against the law itself. But the anti-voter ID position is so absurd, so lacking in any factual basis whatsoever, that I doubt that any small minority exists. They exist only in the imaginations of infantilizing politicians like Kamala Harris, who think that rural Americans exist in some kind of 18th century time warp. Or at least they pretend to think that. As fun as it is to mock this sort of thing, we can't make the mistake of believing that Kamala Harris actually believes it. If she did, then she would be stupid and sheltered and ignorant in the extreme, but still basically well-meaning. She's not well-meaning. She knows, they all know, that any adult human in the country can easily qualify to vote even under the most stringent voter ID laws currently being enacted or proposed. All these laws will do is confirm that the people voting are who they say they are, just as you have to prove that you are who you say you are in order to do almost anything else in adult life, from buying alcohol to renting a car to staying at a hotel to procuring an apartment or a home, etc. The people who oppose the laws then oppose them because they want the process of voting to be far less secure than the process of buying a six-pack of Heineken at the gas station. And why is that? Because they want voter fraud. There is no other reason to take the position that they've taken. That is pretty clear. And for that reason, Kamala Harris is canceled. Listen, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.